Good vach, Shavua Tov. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Sharon and Shandora. Great to see you. And over on the YouTube side, Aoife and Spencer, who's visiting family in Durango, Colorado. Grandkids are the best. Amen. I look forward to that, God willing. And Lorraine in Texas. Welcome, everybody. Let's get busy. Relatively short daf and nice on a Saturday night. We're continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 3 of Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. Our daf is page 52. We picked this up right at the bottom of page 51b. The sages taught in a baraisa, one may not accept deposits from women and not from slaves and not from children. Accepting deposits as a bailee, as a custodian, a shomer. Whether you're a paid bailee or an unpaid bailee, that's not specified. But what's the issue of accepting a deposit? You can only accept a deposit from the owner of the property that's being deposited with you, and that's the issue here. Since it is likely that they do not own the property, they might have taken the item without authorization from their husband, their master, or their parent, respectively. So consequently, one should not accept the deposit. If, however, one accepted a deposit from a woman, he must return it to the woman, as he cannot be certain that it is not hers. And if the woman died, he must return it to her husband, as he is her heir. If one accepted a deposit from a slave, he must return it to the slave, since it might not belong to the master. And if the slave died, he must return it to the master. Now we're on page 52a. If one accepted a deposit from a minor, he cannot return it to the minor, as a minor is unable to properly safeguard the item. So instead, if he cannot return it to the minor's parent, which is not actually even suggested, but the Gemara simply says, instead, he must make a safe investment, a segula, for him, and if the minor dies, then he returns it to his heirs. And with regard to all these people who said at the time of their death that the deposited item belongs to so-and-so, so the bailee should act as they had explained. And if their explanation was not credible, then the bailee should form an explanation of their explanation. This is a very interesting phrase, right? So the idea here is that we're talking, I guess, still about the woman, the slave, or the minor, right? People for whom you have a reason to believe that they might not be the owner. But you don't, you have reason to believe they might not be the owner, as especially in the ancient world, women didn't so often have independent property. Slaves, if you know that it's a slave standing before you, you know that they generally don't have independent property. And a minor, cannot be safeguarding the property if you return it to him. But then they're just taking this one step further. They were definitely sort of testing the limits of our understanding of the halacha. Right, so this woman, slave, or minor deposited property with the custodian, and then they were on their deathbed, and they said that the property belongs to so-and-so, right? So not themselves, but that they gave it to the custodian on behalf of someone else. Okay, so then you listen to them. But if there's a reason to believe that this explanation doesn't make sense, then you should form an explanation of their explanation. So what they're saying is the explanation doesn't make sense, and therefore the explanation of the explanation doesn't make sense. And so what an explanation of an explanation means is that you disregard the explanation, and you would simply give it to the next logical person, which would be the heir, right? Ignore what they said. Oh, I'm sorry. So then, if you have no reason to believe who this property goes to, I'm not sure what you do with it. The note says keep them for yourself. But that's odd, right? So let's just read. Oh, I'm sorry. The explanation. You should form an explanation of their explanation, and this means ignore what they said. So what does that mean? If you ignore what they said when they dropped this property off with you as a custodian, and then their explanation of who it really belongs to doesn't make sense, so you ignore it. So what are you going to do with the property? Presumably you give it to an heir, or if there was an adult that was associated with this minor, etc. You're going to have to do some investigating to see who the property really belongs to. Now the Gemara relates an incident. When the wife of Rabba bar Chana was dying, she said, "These rings that are in my possession belong to Marta and the sons of her daughter." So Rabba bar Chana came before Rav to ask what he should do. And Rav said to him, "So if she is credible in your eyes, act as she had explained. And if not, form an explanation for her explanation and disregard what she said." And there are those who say that this is what Rav said to him. If you assess that it is likely that the rings were deposited with her, act as she had explained. And if not, form an explanation of her explanation, which means disregard it. So the Baraisa stated that if the bailee took a deposit from a minor, he must make a safe investment for him. And the Gemara asks, what is meant by a safe investment? And Rav Chisda says the bailee should purchase a Torah scroll for the minor, since the Torah scroll will never go down in value. And Rabba bar Rav Huna says he should purchase a date palm from which the minor will consume dates. Why are we talking about the law of Shomrim? Why are we talking about a custodian who's asked to watch something? Because we're still talking about establishing a presumption of ownership, right? Establishing a presumption of ownership. Well, when something is deposited with you, then obviously you don't have a presumption of ownership of it. You're holding it for someone else. What if this person who left it with you, it's questionable if they are the owner? That's why we're talking about this. Now, new subject. The Mishna teaches, back to presumption of ownership established by 3 years of possession. And a father does not have the ability to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to a son's property, and a son does not have the ability to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to a father's property. And Rabbi Yosef says, even if they separated and the son is no longer dependent on his father, the presumption of ownership still cannot be established by a father or son with regard to the other's property. Rava says, if they separated, then this is not the law, right? So if a son is living in his father's house, dependent on his father's table, or presumably, if the father's an older gentleman and he's living in the son's house, but they're sharing property, as it were, then the fact that one appears to be residing and have possession of the property of the other will not establish a presumption of ownership. But if the son has moved out of the family home, he has his own family, his own house, he's financially completely independent from his parents, and then he takes possession of a property that belonged to his father previously and resides on it or makes use of it for 3 years, then he can establish that presumption of ownership. And if, for example, one of his brothers comes and challenges that ownership and saying, hey, we were supposed to inherit that together, then this son can say, well, you should have said something during the last 3 years. Now you're going to have to prove because I have the presumption of ownership. But this is only in the case where the son has been, the one who has the presumption of ownership, has been fully independent from the father before he took possession of this property. That's according to Rava. The Mishna seemed to say that father and son can never establish presumption of ownership and doesn't bring up this exception for a son who has become independent from the father. Rava says we do listen to that exception, and if independent, then there is no presumption of ownership. And now the other sages are going to weigh in on whether they hold like Rava or not. So Rav Yirmiyah Difti said, Rav Papi performed an action and ruled that if the father and son separated, this is not the law, meaning that we can establish a presumption of ownership. So he follows Rava. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said that Rav Chia from the city of Hurmiz Ardeshid
told me that Rav Acha bar Yaakov told him in the name of Rav Nachman bar Yaakov, if the father and son separated, then we don't follow the Mishnah. In other words, he follows Rava. And the Gemara notes, and this is the law, if the father and son separated, this is not the halacha, meaning we don't follow the Mishnah, so everyone seems to follow Rava. And we can establish a presumption of ownership for one or the other in the case that they've been independent before the possession began. And this is also taught in a baraisa. A son who separated himself from his father's finances and the wife who became divorced are all like other people with regard to establishing the presumption of ownership. So just as a husband and wife cannot establish a presumption of ownership over the property of the other, once they're divorced, then they're like any two people in the world, and if one has a credible claim of how he came to possess the land, like he or she purchased it and then resided on it for 3 years, the presumption of ownership will hold. New subject. It was stated there was a case of one of the brothers in a family who was engaging in commerce in the house, managing the family finances after the death of their father. And there were bills of sale and other documents circulating with his name appearing as the owner of the property and as a lender. And that brother said, the money and the property are mine, as they fell to me as an inheritance, not from our father, but rather from the father of my mother, who is not the mother of the other brothers. Right? So you have a few brothers who all have the same father, but different mothers. They've all been living in a house, but it turns out that that house, which their father previously ran the household, but that property actually came into the family from this boy's mother. Right? The other boys have a different mother. This boy, it was his mother's house that she inherited from her father, his maternal grandfather. So he is the sole heir of his maternal grandfather. His half-brothers, who are all paternal half-brothers, they do not inherit from his maternal grandfather because they are not grandsons of his maternal grandfather. So he's saying, yeah, we've all lived in this house for a while, but it's my house. It's not our house. So in that case, Rav says it is upon him to bring proof that this house belonged to his maternal grandfather and that's how he inherited it. And if he can't prove that, right, then he's not going to have a presumption of ownership. Shmuel says, it is going to be upon his brothers, his paternal half-brothers, to bring proof that the money or the property belonged to their common father and consequently now belongs to all of them. Presumably why? Because he's been handling the affairs of the house and acting as the sole owner of the house for more than 3 years. Now, Shmuel says, Abba, by which he means Rav, concedes to me that if that brother dies, it is upon the other brothers to bring proof in order to collect money from the deceased brother's heirs. Right? So now, once he says that this was my house that I inherited from my maternal grandfather, and then he dies, well, his brothers don't inherit that house. Right? That house needs to go to his children if he has them, or presumably back into his mother's family, because that's where the property came from. And if his brothers want to challenge that that's where the property came from, they're going to have to bring proof. The burden of proof is on them, meaning that the presumption of ownership did lay with the brother who was running things for several years. Now, Rav Papa objects to this addendum from Shmuel. Do we claim on behalf of orphans anything that their father could not claim for them? Right? In other words, if Rav says that he has to prove it, right? Shmuel says, no, his half-brothers have to prove it. And then Shmuel says, and Rav concedes to me that if the boy dies, then those brothers are going to have to prove it. Well, why would Rav concede that? Right? If when the guy is alive, according to Rav, he has to prove it, then why when he dies, the burden of proof shifts to the brothers? Right, so that's what Rav Papa is objecting to. Do we claim on behalf of orphans anything that their father could not claim for them? But didn't Rava remove a pair of scissors used for cutting garments and a book of Agadah, meaning a book of teaching stories, from orphans without requiring the prior owner who had asked the orphans to return these items to bring proof of ownership? And he would rule the same in the case of all items with regard to which it is common for them to be lent. And the one in possession has no presumption of ownership. In other words, once again, if you have a reason to be possessing these items other than the fact that you bought them or inherited them or were gifted them, if there's another explanation, like they're commonly borrowed, or you were a sharecropper, or you were a husband and wife, or all these other reasons that we've talked about, then there is no presumption of ownership. Now we're on 52b. As Rav Huna bar Avin sent a ruling, if one, other than the one previously established to be the owner, is in possessions of items that are typically lent or rented, and he says they are purchased, and that is why they are in my possession, he is not deemed credible. So in this case as well, as the father of the orphans could not be awarded these documents without bringing proof, the same should be true of his orphans. Why then would Rav concede to Shmuel? And the Gemara concedes. Yeah, this is difficult. Rav Chisda says that they, meaning Rav, taught his ruling that the brother must bring proof that he owns the property listed in the documents that appear under his name only when they do not divide any of their property, even with regard to their dough, i.e. they share everything, even their food. But if they divide with regard to their dough, say that this brother removed money from his own portion, i.e. he reduces expenses for food, thereby amassing his own property. Right? So the reason that his name Interesting. I've been saying that in this case that we've been talking about, that this older brother is acting as the householder, that it's the house that he owns. But that's not what the Gemara said. I apologize. The Gemara said that this one brother was engaging in commerce while living in the house, managing the family finances after the death of their father, and there were bills of sale and other documents circulating with his name appearing as the owner of the property and as a lender. And the brother said, well, no, what I said is right. The money and the property are mine, right? So he's saying that these commercial instruments, right, these documents representing commercial transactions, right, these are assets. He has some kind of investments in various things. He's been lending out money. He's been investing. And he owns the house. And so he's saying that all of this, that the house was something I inherited, and I've been doing business based on my ownership of the house, and all this belongs to me. Right? So now let's go back to where we are. Right, so Rav Chisda says that Rav taught this ruling that the brother must bring proof that he owns the property listed in the documents that appear under his name, only when they do not divide any of their property. Right? They've all been living just sort of sharing the food and the space and everything. There hasn't been any division of assets. But if there's some kind of division of assets, like they've each been drawing down an allowance from the estate, as it were, then he doesn't have to prove anything, because he can say that with respect to the investments and the documents that attest to, loans he's been issuing, or like I said, investments, and he can say, well, that just came from my share of the estate, so there's nothing to even talk about with respect to that. With respect to his ownership of the house, it's the same conversation we've already been having. Now, with regard to the requirement that proof be brought, the Gemara asks, with what is one considered to have brought proof? And Rabbah said, well, proof is brought with the testimony of witnesses that he purchased the property listed in the document, or he granted the loan with his own money, or that he inherited it from his mother's family. So Rav Sheshes says proof is brought with the court's ratification of the document in which his name appears. Right? If he doesn't get the presumption of ownership, according to Rav, right, Shmuel would give it to him, and then the other brothers have to prove that he doesn't have it. But according to Rav, he's going to have to prove that this property really does belong to him. And so they're saying, well, what constitutes proof? So it's either like he can show by testimony of witnesses where he got the money, how he got the inheritance, where he spent it, etc. And Rav Sheshes says ratification of the document, like he has to show the legal documents. Now, Rava said, now that's a pretty high burden of proof. So if any of these documents are missing, he's not going to get this property. One more reason why anytime you're entering into any kind of a transaction that involves a contract, get a lawyer, right? Or if you're talking about in the Jewish world, make sure you have an expert rabbi who's going to help you get the proper documentation. Because everybody's friends in the beginning, but then when the conflict comes, you better have the paper trail, right? Now, Rava said to Rav Nachman, this is the opinion of Rav, and this is the opinion of Shmuel, and this is the opinion of Rabbah, and this is the opinion of Rav Sheshes. So in accordance with whose opinion does the master hold? And Rav Nachman said to him, just a second. Sorry to keep you in suspense. And Rav Nachman said to him, I know a baraisa, which is the source of my opinion, as it is taught, in a case where there was one of the brothers who was engaging in commerce in the house, managing the family finances, and there were bills of sale and other documents circulating with his name appearing as the owner of the property or as a lender. And that brother said, the money and the property are mine, as they fell to me as an inheritance from the house of the father of my mother, who is not the mother of the other brothers. It is upon him to bring proof of ownership. So apparently this baraisa holds like Rav, and that's what Rav Nachman does too. So the baraisa continues, that same baraisa that he's bringing as a proof. And similarly, in the case of a woman, i.e. a widow, if her husband's heirs see that she is engaging in commerce in the house with the property that had belonged to her husband, and there were bills of sale and other documents circulating with her name appearing on them as the owner, and she said, the money and the property are mine alone, as they fell to me as an inheritance from the house of the father of my father, or from the house of the father of my mother, and never belonged to my husband, then it would be upon her to bring proof. Rav Nachman consequently holds in accordance with the opinion of Rav. Now, having quoted the baraisa, the Gemara seeks to clarify it and asks, what is the purpose of the clause in the baraisa that begins, and similarly, where the law appears to be identical to the first clause, right? In terms of the difference between a brother saying that this came from his maternal family and not from his father's family vis-a-vis his half-brothers who are paternal half-brothers. And now the case of the widow seems to be exactly the same holding. So why is the case of the widow given if we could have learned it out from the first case? So lest you say that in the case of the woman, since the matter is laudable for her, in that she's taking care of the household finances, in that people say she is toiling on behalf of orphans, she would not steal from the orphans, and is therefore deemed credible if she says that the property in the documents that bear her name is her own, that baraisa teaches us that this assumption cannot be relied upon, and she must bring proof of ownership. So if you're in a situation where in the normal course of things, the property would be assumed to be shared with other people and not be yours exclusively, and you're claiming that it is yours exclusively, so you better have proof. New subject. The Mishna teaches, in what case is this statement that one establishes the presumption of ownership after profiting from the property for a certain duration said? This is what we've been talking about for many pages now. When do we have a presumption of ownership? In what case do we say this? It is said in a case of one who has mere possession of the property, which does in some cases serve as proof of ownership. Right? The fact that he's been there for 3 years in some cases serves as proof of ownership when it's coupled with a claim of how he bought the property. In other cases, it doesn't serve as a presumption of ownership because he has a reason to be there other than buying it, like being a sharecropper. But in a case of one who gives a gift, or brothers who received an inheritance and divided it, or one who takes possession of the property of a convert who died without heirs, and his property is therefore now ownerless, as soon as one locked the door of the property or fenced it or breached its fence even a bit, this is considered taking possession of the property and effects acquisition. Here we're saying that the kinds of activities like residing in it, fencing it, showing that you have possession of it, which normally would have to take 3 years to create a presumption of ownership, in a case where you're claiming ownerless property or you're receiving a gift and performing the kinyan, the formal act of acquisition of that gift or of that inheritance, well then as soon as you show that you're possessing it by, for instance, putting a fence around it or changing the property in some way, showing that you have taken formal possession of it, well then you create ownership immediately, because no one is challenging your ownership. This is simply the act by which you formally acquire the property. Now the Gemara asks, well, is that to say that all of these whom we previously said possessed the field for 3 years are not subject to the laws of taking possession of property in this manner? It's saying, are we saying that the people in our Mishnah who can take possession by being in possession, who can get a presumption of ownership by being in possession of property for 3 years, because we've established that law for them, therefore they don't qualify for the law which says that, if you just inherited it, then as soon as you put a fence around it, you formally acquired it? Now somehow they don't formally acquire it because they have to possess it for 3 years? Obviously not, but the Gemara is asking that question. And the Gemara responds that our Mishnah is incomplete. And this is what our Mishnah is teaching. In what case is this statement said? It is said with regard to possession that is accompanied by a claim, i.e., when the possessor has a claim to counter that of a claimant, such as where the seller, who is now a claimant, says, I never sold it to you, and the buyer says, you did sell it to me, I purchased this from you 4 years ago, and I've been here for 4 years, then that's where the presumption of ownership works. But where no one is challenging his ownership, then as soon as he steps on it, he has that presumption of ownership. But with regard to possession that does not need to be accompanied by a claim, as the prior owner concedes that the one in possession is the owner, such as a case where another person gives one a gift, or where brothers who divided their property that they inherited, or there is one who takes possession of the property of a convert who died without heirs, where the function of possessing the item is only to acquire it and not to establish a presumption of ownership. So then if one locked the door of the property or fenced it or breached its fence even a bit, this is considered taking possession of the property. Rav Hoshaya teaches in the Baraisa of Tractate Kedushin that was taught in the school of Levi, if one locked the doors of the property or fenced it or breached its fence even a bit, if this was done in the presence of the seller, this is considered taking possession of the property, right? This is another form of kinyan that's being argued now, that we said, right? You're buying a property, and so you give the seller the money. Do you now have formal possession of the property? It's not enough to give the money. You also have to do the formal acquisition. Now, in the past, we've said, what's the formal acquisition for taking possession of real property? That you get the deed of sale for the property, or there's a formal act like you transfer a handkerchief from the buyer to the seller. I think it's from the buyer. I think actually it's from the seller to the buyer. But at any rate, in the presence of witnesses, you transfer this handkerchief or the bill of sale. That's definitely from the seller to the buyer. Then now the property has officially changed hands. The mere transfer of money might not be enough. But what about these other actions, like fencing it in or locking the door? Can that act as the kinyan? Can that act as the formal act of acquisition? And now it seems that the Gemara said, if you did that act, showing that you possess the land, like fencing it or locking the door, and you did it in the presence of the seller, and presumably in the presence of witnesses who see you do it in the presence of the seller, then that is a kinyan. So the Gemara asks, one could infer that in his presence, the presence of the seller, yes, he acquires it. but not in his presence, not in the presence of the seller, then this is not an act of acquisition. But why not? In any event, he has taken possession, and Rav has said that this is what Rav Hoshai is saying. If the act was performed in the seller's presence, then the seller doesn't need to say to him, go take possession and thereby acquire the property. Since the buyer is performing this act that looks like taking possession, fencing it, locking it, etc., and he's doing it in front of the seller, and the seller doesn't object, and witnesses have seen this, the buyer has taken possession of the land. Now we're on 53A, and we're almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. But if this act was performed not in the seller's presence, then the seller must explicitly instruct him, go take possession and thereby acquire the property for him to acquire it. Rav raises a dilemma. How does one acquire a gift? I.e., is it necessary for the giver to say, go take possession and thereby acquire it? Does he have to explicitly say that? Shmuel said, what dilemma is raised to Abba? That's what Shmuel calls Rav. So what dilemma is raised to Rav? Now, one could say the following. And what is the law with regard to a sale where the buyer is giving money to the seller? If the seller says to the buyer, go take possession and thereby acquire the property, the acquisition does take effect. But if he does not explicitly say this, it does not, assuming that the act is not done in his presence. Therefore, with regard to a gift, where no money is given to the seller, is it not all the more so, kal v'chomer, reasonable that the acquisition not take effect without a clear directive from the seller? And the Gemara answers, and Rav holds that it is possible to say that one who gives a gift gives it generously and would allow the acquisition even absent a clear directive. Rav might say that, but it's not the law. And what is the law with regard to a sale, etc.? In order to acquire a gift, the recipient must be instructed by the giver to take possession of it, and then he must take possession of it, because an item given as a gift must be acquired by the same means as an item that was sold, and this is in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel. So we hold by Shmuel in this regard. Looks like I have no questions. So that's what I've got for tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. I'm pretty sure that, just to preview, on Monday, which is Erev Tisha B'Av, we're going to have class at noon. We're going to do the Friday schedule of having class at noon on Monday. Tomorrow regular time, Monday noon Pacific, because Erev Tisha B'Av, we don't want to be learning Torah right before Tisha B'Av begins. We don't learn Torah on Tisha B'Av, and we won't have class at all on Tuesday, and we'll then resume on Wednesday. But tomorrow, Sunday, regular schedule, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night and a great week. Good Vok, Shavua Tov.